Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Atchley, and he's leading off the section of the program that we're calling The Brain Science Behind the Problem. We know when surveyed that the majority of drivers will tell you that they think texting while driving is dangerous. Yet millions of drivers continue to do it. A nationally recognized expert on distracted driving and the human brain, Dr. Atchley, has some insights into why many of us continue to talk or text while driving, even when we believe it's wrong. Dr. Atchley is a professor of psychology at the University of Kansas, and for more than 25 years has been conducting research that explores attention and vision and the relationship to driving. He is frequently called on by the national media and safety groups to explain the dangers of distracted driving, and specifically how the brain can trick us into thinking we safely multitask when behind the wheel. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Atchley.
I'm glad to be back here in the state of Texas. I think this is my third Texas Distracted Driving Summit. I'm always happy to come serve this state. My mom's from Monahans. My father's from Allen, Texas. My wife's family is one of the old 300. She likes to remind me every time I come down to Texas. This is a very important issue. I'm going to be talking today about some brain science related to the issue of distracted driving. What I'm going to try to unpack is this image that you see here. Now, this is something a student sent me. She said, "Oh, I was driving, you needed to see this." And then she quickly corrected herself, said, "Oh, I didn't take the picture. My boyfriend took it while I was driving." I want to believe that that's true. But when you look at this is really interesting because you have someone that's driving their motorcycle in hands-free mode using their phone, and at the same time they're wearing their helmet, which in the state of Kansas is not a requirement. So if we can understand this, I think this can help us understand this issue more generally. And I think you've already gotten lots of really great information today to help you in what you're doing. But before we start, I want you to do what we do in church. I want you to turn to someone that's near you and say, "Thank you for your service for safety. Thank you for helping reduce distracted driving." So please do that right now. This was, I don't think we do this enough, and we should, because everyone in this room is engaged in some way, shape, or form trying to prevent more losses like Mike experienced with his daughter, Alana. And there is, I think, nothing more important for us than to be engaged on the issue of distracted driving, which leads to so many preventable deaths for the purpose of someone just saying, "Hey, what are you doing?" or "Hey, I'm going to Snapchat you to keep you from being bored while you drive." If we can solve this problem, if we can prevent men like Mike losing his daughter, I think we will have all had a life of service that was very worthwhile. So thank you all for your service and what you're doing here. Here's what I'd like to do today. I've got 4 things that I'd like to accomplish today. I want to talk a little bit about the research. I'm a researcher. I've been doing this for a little while. If I didn't talk about the research, you would wonder why I was here in the first place. But I'm going to try to keep that overview fairly brief, but also fairly broad. I want you to understand that this is not really a new or understudied problem. This is something we've got a lot of data on. I shouldn't have to convince you with data, but I'll give you a few points that I think are really important. I'm going to talk a little about what the future holds. We're going to have a great talk after the break from Dr. Jim Roberts, who is going to talk about some of the addiction piece. I'll talk about that very briefly, but I think you need to understand that this is not a problem that's going to be going away anytime soon. Then I want to try to educate you on how your brain works. Ultimately, this will be a conversation about your brain and how your brain works as a driver. And if I don't do anything else today, what I want to convince you of is that your brain's not quite as good as you think it is, and that when you take that brain with you on the road, it doesn't do quite as much as you think it does. And for all of you, when you leave this building, to look at that phone as you've got that phone in one hand and the car door handle in the other as a threat to your safety, and for you at that point to make a good decision. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think we can solve this problem. And this is based upon problems that we haven't solved, but we've done much better with, things like seatbelts and to some extent drunk driving. And I think there's some lessons there that can really inform us as we're moving forward into the area of distracted driving. So there's no question distraction's killing us. You know, we have the statistics. We'll talk about those some more. You've already heard some of those statistics. We know you've got various numbers around here, 492 in Texas. That's 492 people that died in 2015 from distraction that we know about. It's probably closer to 1,000 because we underreport by about 50%. So we know that this is a problem. We've known that it's a problem for a long time, and it's a big one. What people don't really realize is that this is not a new problem as far as research is concerned. Actually, this is a half-century-old issue. The first study of phones in cars was conducted in 1966. It was published in 1969, but really the work has been done for half of a century. Now, back then they were called car phones. They took up the entire trunk. Not everyone had one. But researchers who were looking at driving back then were interested to understand what would happen if people were trying to use a phone while they were driving. And this is something we have been studying consistently since. And we've studied this in lots of different ways. When I tell you that I know, I don't just think, but I know that using a phone in any manner while you're driving is unsafe, I'm not saying that based upon a handful of studies. I'm saying that based upon hundreds of studies over many years with many people and with many methodologies, all pointing to very similar conclusions. For example, we can look at the phone records of people that were in crashes. In fact, one of these studies was done by an organization, IIHS, that you'll hear a researcher from IIHS in a while, looking at the phone records of people that were in crashes. In one case, crashes that led to injuries and thus hospital room visit. Another case where crashes didn't result in injuries. These studies were done in different places at different times, but the researchers concluded in both cases that your likelihood of being in a crash, if you're on the phone in those 10 minutes prior to the crash, goes up 4 to 4.5 times, regardless of if you're on the phone hands held or hands free. Now keep in mind, two things here. One, these are studies that are done by different folks, different places, different times, different groups, coming to the same conclusions. Second, one of the studies, Redelmeyer's study, concluded if you actually look at drunk driving statistics, that's equivalent to the risk of being drunk for crashes. In fact, if you, like my good friend and colleague Dave Strayer at the University of Utah, take a drunk driver and have them drive your driving simulator, and actually I should probably correct that, if you take on the University of Utah campus where you cannot get someone drunk, but you can bring them to .079 and then put them in a driving simulator, have them drive the driving simulator, then bring them back and have them drive that same scenario sober, but talking on a hands-free device to someone that's not in the car with them, they drive better when they're drunk. The drunk driver recognizes that they're impaired. And because they recognize that they're impaired, what they attempt to do is drive sometimes more slowly. They try to give themselves more space between them and the person in front of them on certain parts of the drive. But when they notice an event, they tend to overcompensate for that event, like a car stopping suddenly in front of them, and they crush the brakes in the simulator. The person on the cell phone, when that car in front of them stops, many times does not even notice the vehicle stopping, and they drive right through the car, which in the real world would be a crash. And when you ask that person, how well did you drive? They say, oh, I drove great. And you say, what about the couple times you drove right through a car? Well, what was going on there? Well, that didn't happen. The person on the phone is completely unaware of how impaired they are. And we're going to talk about this a bit more when we talk about your brain. But the drunk driver, because they are impaired, but they know they're impaired, don't experience quite the risky level of driving that the sober driver but distracted does, at least in the driving simulator. We've done research using devices that are designed to measure the attention of older adults to screen them from the roadway. This is called the useful field of view. It measures the extent of your visual attention. It's used in some countries to actually screen older drivers from the road. We've given this attention task to younger drivers, 19-year-olds, and they look like fighter pilots. They look fantastic. They're at the peak of their game. Their brain's great as far as visual attention goes. Reaction time's amazing. But when we give them that same task and we have them simply engage in a hands-free conversation, they look like a 70-year-old adult with dementia. If they had the score where they're actually about 4 times more slow in detecting visual information, they had that score and they were in Australia, I would send them to a physician to start the process of taking their license away. Again, these are 19-year-olds who are perfectly capable, but when you get the brain trying to do 2 things at the same time, it doesn't do it very well. And that's because we don't multitask. Our brain makes choices. We task switch. And our brain is forced to make choices. Driving seems easy, but it takes a long time to learn how to drive effectively. It takes training. Talking seems easy, but if you think about talking's not easy. It took years for you to learn to speak coherently. If you have the misfortune of having someone in your family that's had a stroke, language is probably the first thing that is affected. It takes more of your brain to speak than anything else that we do, and driving is also similarly complicated. And so it's no wonder then when you look at the brain of someone who's trying to look at the world around them, and what you're seeing is a brain scan here, and that red indicates brain activity, and you scan the area of the brain, occipital cortex in the back, which is in large part responsible for seeing the world. And then you simply ask that person to start listening to sentences, not talk, not plan to talk. They know they're going to get quizzed later, but just listen to sentences. Now what you see is the area of the brain responsible for seeing the world starts to turn off. And those resources shift to areas in temporal cortexes responsible for hearing. And all of you have experienced this yourself because you've probably had conversations with people who have been driving when they're on the phone. What does the conversation sound like? Is it a completely fluent conversation? Or is it more like, yeah, what, right. What you're hearing there at that point in time is their brain trying to take resources away from the conversation that you're having and put it back in visual processing areas, decision-making areas, so they can actually see the road around them and make good decisions. And when you say, honey, are you listening to me? And they say, oh, yes, yeah, I am. Yeah. Oh, no, I'm listening. Sure, I'll pick that up. No, everything's fine. Everything's going great. What you've just done is you've robbed their brain of the ability to see the world around them. I want you to imagine on the street that you live in whatever town it is, where you have a child playing on the sidewalk, or maybe you have a grandchild playing on the sidewalk, a driver driving through that neighborhood, and the driver that you want driving through that neighborhood where your kid or grandkid's playing. The attentive driver is the one that you want. You want that attentive driver with that big box scanning the roadway as far as they can down the road, like my grandmother taught me to drive, looking on the right for that kid getting ready to leave the sidewalk, chasing a toy into the road, on the left-hand side for cars that are getting ready to drive in front of them. That's what you want on your roads. But what you get with the brain of a driver that's engaging in a hands-free conversation with someone that's not in the vehicle with them is that small blue box. You get a driver who's scanning about the width of the steering wheel and about the distance of the front bumper of the car. And when your grandson or son or granddaughter or daughter leaves the sidewalk and gets in the roadway, they don't spot them until they're right in front of the car and under the wheels. We think that we can do these things at once, but our brain has to make choices, and what it's doing when it makes a choice to have the conversation is it's having to then restrict the amount of information that the brain can process. And while you, using your hands-free device, drive around the states of Texas, feel like you're looking out the world and you're driving safely, you're really just looking in a very small area of the world. And how many crashes happen in that small box? The crash happens there, but it could have been prevented if we'd been looking someplace else. We've been constructing a visualizable database of all the research done since 1969, looking at the effect of performance, the effect on performance for distractions, not just calls, but things like eating and reaching and others. Now, we've collected over 400 at this point. We've categorized 342 studies that cover about 1,608 measurements spanning about 20,000 people. Lots of different laboratories, lots of different techniques. And I can tell you, when you put all of those data together, the picture is very clear. What you're looking at here are classifications of the data in 3 ways. Either the data found no effect for that distraction on performance, that's that yellow area, the medium-sized area, a positive effect for the distraction actually made your performance better, or a negative effect for that distraction on driving performance. I think it's pretty clear. If you just compared hands-free to hands-held here, what you would see is the hands-free data, 81.7% of the time, the study indicates that that has a negative effect on driving performance. If you look at hands held, it's something like 80.7% of the time. There's no difference between hands-free and hands held because it's your brain, not your hands. And this is not just one study. This is not 2 studies. This is not 3 studies. We're looking at the effect of using your phone to do something like text. That's 115 data points spanning thousands of people. We're looking at something like talking hands-free, 219. We know the damn answer at this point. Excuse my language. I don't need to do another study to demonstrate that there is a negative impact for using your phone in any manner on driving performance. We don't need to hit you with statistics. We know the answer at this point, sadly. National Safety Council a few years ago estimated about a quarter of the crashes on our roadways are due to a phone in the car. This is actually an underestimate. I know the person who did this. She's very conservative. It was also using assumptions from a few years ago, and the use rates back then, those use rates have skyrocketed. It's probably a lot worse now. We also know that when we say 492 people in Texas have died, that's an underestimate because when the National Safety Council took actual crashes that we knew were caused by a phone and then looked at the Fatality Accident Reporting System database to see if a distraction was noted as a cause for that crash, only about half the time did we capture the data that the distraction was the cause of that fatal crash. So we're probably underreporting by at least 50%. This is probably a lot bigger than we think. I used to say that this problem is going to get worse. I have to say worse is here now. I don't think anyone in this room probably fails to understand that our crash rates are increasing. Is anyone here not aware of the latest data on crash rates going up? Good. We now have experienced, I think what someone from NHTSA said was the largest increase in crashes in the last 50 years. We're back where we were years ago in terms of our crash and fatality rates, and I'll talk about fatality rates in a second. We're not doing well. We're not doing well, and you can look at things like speed and drunk driving, lack of seatbelt use. Some of those things are going up. But when you factor out a lot of those other things, there's a lot of data left over that aren't explainable by anything else, and it's distractions, because we know that there are more of them, that there are more people using them, that we're not enforcing against distractions in vehicles. And here's something that came to me when I was presenting these data at Network of Employers for Traffic Safety about 2 weeks ago that I want each one of you to think about. Think about having, let's say, 40,000 fatalities on our roadways this coming year. And compare that to 40,000 fatalities in the 60s. Seems like it's the same, but it's not. Because if we lose 40,000 people now with improved road design, with improved vehicles, with improved emergency response systems, with better hospital care, a higher likelihood of survival, if we're losing the same number of people now that we were losing decades ago, we're doing far, far worse. Right? People should survive more. And yet if we're at the same numbers, we're not just holding the line, we're a lot worse than we think we're doing. So when I used to say it's going to get worse, it is worse. And it's because of distraction in large part. There are some other things we need to be working on. Drug driving is going to be an important issue. Drunk driving is always an important issue. Seatbelt use is very important. But this is a big one. Because risk exposure, the number of people using these devices and the frequency of use just keeps going up. Now, I'm not going to try to talk too much about the addiction angle because we're going to have a great talk on that in a bit. But I just want to point out that these devices are used from a very early age, and they're used for something very important, to be social. A teenager, anyone here have a teenager between 16 and 19? Raise your hand. All right, you know, if you want to get a hold of them, what do you have to do? Send a text, right. Where are you? Come down to dinner. Send, right. Because, you know, it makes sense because they talk to their friends via text twice as often as they talk to their friends face to face. These devices are used for something very important, to be social, to have relationships. And so we think, oh, we're just going to do some safety messages. Oh, yeah, don't text and drive. It's really bad. It's dangerous. And that's going to have an effect. Really? This is the most important thing for the generation under 34 now. And the other thing that you have to realize is that it's important because people cannot imagine not using these devices. When we ask students at the University of Kansas to put their phones down and disconnect and not use media for 24 to 48 hours, these are the kinds of reactions you get. I came to realize that 5 minutes without checking a text is like the end of the world, right? Probably some of your sons and daughters sound like that. You know, I went 5 hours without media, I was a wreck. The withdrawals were too much for me to handle. I had a young woman say, I lose my iPhone every once in a while, I feel like I'm missing an arm. I feel handicapped, right? And why is it like this? Why is it like this? Because the brain wants this. These phones are just wired into us. You know the one thing that the brain really loves? The one thing it loves, you guys think, you love your spouse, you love your dog, you love chocolate. You really don't. You love dopamine and serotonin, the two reward chemicals that come along with all of those things, right? It's a little neuroscience joke, pardon me, but really what we love is what our brain tells us that we enjoy. And so dopamine's a big one. It's a reward chemical that comes along with lots of things. For example, does anyone really love folding laundry? Raise your hand. Oh, a couple of people, outstanding. I usually need about 500 people in the audience before I get someone to admit, but I just did a talk to 200 people, and this is about 200, so that sounds about right. Okay, how do you feel when you finish folding a basket of laundry? Give me one word. Woosah. All right. Satisfied. Good. No one else admits to loving folding laundry, but I can guess if I were to have you all put down one word, you'd say something like satisfied, accomplished, I feel good, right? Even if you don't love folding laundry and you pass it on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, okay, I'll fold it. Thursday, you fold it. You feel good because your brain chemical, once you're done with that task, your brain is going to give you a chemical called dopamine, which is there to get you to fold the darn laundry the second time, to reinforce behaviors. Our brain does this to reinforce us to do things we might not otherwise do. When it comes to talking on the phone, the brain gives us a huge rush of dopamine. And what does the brain really give us a big rush for? Talking about ourselves. What you're looking at is a brain scan here of the neural networks that are involved when someone actually starts talking about themselves. When instead of just telling someone, oh, the weather is nice, they say, oh, I was just outside and I was eating this sandwich, here's a picture, and the weather was nice, I think it's great. When you start talking about yourself, your brain gives you a huge rush of dopamine. Think about what Facebook does. It gives you the opportunity to tell your opinions to lots of other people. Dopamine, dopamine, dopamine. These devices are drug delivery systems. If this is a phone, I would call it a drug delivery system because what it allows you to do is when it goes off, you know someone who likes you wants to contact you. Oh, someone in my social network wants to talk to me. Dopamine. Oh, it's Gwen. Maybe she has something nice to say about my talk. That's great. I like Gwen. Dopamine. And Gwen, I'm safely back in Kansas. I had a really lovely time. It was a great group. Big rush of dopamine. Right? These are drug delivery systems, and we think we're just going to tell people, please don't use them. That would be great. Okay, thanks. No, their brain is wired to make them want to do this. You're going to hear a lot more about the addiction piece. You're going to get a chance, I think, to discover if you are addicted to your phones. That should be exciting. But I think one of the other reasons we have to really be aware of these phones as something dangerous is because our brain fools us in lots of ways. You know, we think about the brain. We think that it helps us do things like understand risk. And we're really bad at understanding risk, I have to tell you. We could run a headline like this for today. More or less, eight people in the 16 to 19-year-old age bracket killed, 960 other people injured in the United States, and it would be an accurate headline for today. I could run the same headline tomorrow. I could run that headline the day after. I could run that headline the day after. And this would be an accurate headline in the United States for 16 to 19-year-olds. And yet those of you with kids that are age 16 to 19, let them drive. And you probably don't freak out about it because it's such an overwhelmingly scary thing. Your brain sort of fools you into thinking it's going to be okay for my kid. They're a good driver. They wouldn't do anything unsafe. When in fact, this is the single riskiest thing that you do under the age of 25. And we've done lots of fancy math models on this. We ask people, do you think texting and driving is dangerous? Oh, yeah. What about talking on the phone? Oh, that's bad too. Do you text and drive? Oh, all the time we text and drive. Well, what if someone gets in a crash when they're texting and driving, or they get in a crash when they're drunk? Which is worse? Oh, the texting driver is far more at fault for that crash than the drunk driver. Okay. Well, tell me, University of Kansas student who tells me that's a bad thing, do you text and drive? Oh, yeah, I do it. Everyone texts and drive. 97% of students at KU text and drive. Now, you have to ask the question the right way. Do you send a text? Do you reply to a text if one of your friends sends it? Do you read a text while you're driving? Do you do it at a stoplight or stop sign? Oh, of course, but that's safe, right? Yeah, no, we studied that too, and you just drive out in the intersection as you're finishing that text. No, that's not safe. Even though people know how risky these behaviors are, knowing that level of risk doesn't change the behavior significantly. It does in a few people, but for the most part, not so much. Our brain fools us into thinking that doesn't apply to me. That's other people. I'm a safe driver. Oops. Can you hit play for me, please? Thank you. Here's the fun part for me as a perception scientist, and that's getting into what the brain really sees. Now, when we think about the brain, we often describe the brain as a complex supercomputer with billions of neurons and trillions of connections, multiple areas dedicated to processing speech and love, being creative. It can do things that, as far as we can tell, no other organism anywhere can do. But I will tell you, if you study this thing long enough, you're convinced it's not quite as good as we think it is. Donuts. We think when we're driving, this is a driving scene from Chicago. We're thinking when we're driving, we have this 180-degree, full-color, motion-based, high-definition, three-dimensional panorama available to us. We can see the woman on the right getting ready to walk out in the street. We can see the SUV on the left getting ready to drive in front of us. And like my grandmother taught me to drive, we see the cars way down the road that are stopping. But everyone hold your fist out at arm's length. Don't hit the person in front of you, but look at your fist. That's about the size of the region that your brain is processing at any one time. Not much. We basically see a fairly small area of vision that, with any clarity as far as our brain is concerned. Everything outside of that is low spatiotemporal resolution, or what I as a scientist call a big fuzzy mess. Your brain doesn't process it. It doesn't really know what's there. It's not really aware of it. It just knows there's stuff, but it doesn't know what kind of stuff. And you have to move your eyes around the world and attend to it in order to be able to see the world. Now, I can tell you this, I can show you some of these demos, but I'm going to give you a demo to try to convince you. So again, I'm going to show you some work I did when I was at the Beckman Institute at the University of Illinois. Now, this is work trying to understand what drivers look at when they're driving. So I'm going to show you a driving scene from a freeway, again, in Chicago. You're going to be in a 1996 Saturn station wagon, the first car that my wife and I bought straight out of graduate school. You're going to be looking out that window, and I want you to imagine as you're driving down the road, what is changing in that driving scene. And I want you to simply raise your hand when you spot the change in the driving scene. Here we go. One person. Don't say what it is. Let everyone play, but got a couple. 3, 4, 5, 6. Everyone's a licensed driver, I assume. A couple more. When I do this with law enforcement folks, like at Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center, they hate this demo. Okay, we are in a limited time frame, so you see that 50-mile-an-hour sign right there? Everyone's like, nothing going on, but you see that 20-story apartment building right next to it that's appearing and disappearing? There it is. There it goes. Over here. There, nothing. Oh, there it is. Right? All right. Everyone see it now? Is it pretty clear? You'll see it now and forever, right? I tricked you, and I admittedly tricked you because what I did was I biased your attention system. Again, it's not just having your eyes open that's important, it's paying attention to the world that's absolutely critical. You only process what you pay attention to. Your attention system really has two ways of working. It can either be captured by things, which is pretty rare, or it can move around the world depending on what your goals are. And so what I did is I gave you a set of goals. I talked about driving, right? And so you moved your attention system around that world like a driver. You looked at the car right in front of you. Boop, that became clear. You then looked at that car right next to it. Boop, that became clear. Nothing happened. Well, that's maybe it's getting really tricky. Let's look at the sign. Now, the sign's big, so you probably had to fixate it a couple times, perhaps, and nothing's going on. And here's what I want you to notice. You then fixated perhaps on that 50-mile-an-hour sign. You see how that first thing kind of disappeared? Military of the United States, military of the former Soviet Union, the military of Israel, as well as some others, have spent billions of dollars on folks like me trying to train pilots and astronauts and others to attend to more than 4 things at the same time. We can't do it. Our brain has a hardwired limit of paying attention to about 4 objects in the environment at any one time. So when you paid attention to that fifth object, that 50-mile-an-hour sign, the first thing you were paying attention to kind of disappeared from your brain. Your brain might have said there was a car there, but it wasn't updating it. It didn't really know what was happening there anymore. The other thing I want you to notice, until I oriented you to that building was changing right next to a place I'm positive almost everyone in this room looked multiple times. And yet you didn't see that huge salient change, because having your eyes open is not what's important. Having your brain attend to something is what's absolutely critical. And even though your eyes are open and you'll see that building appearing and disappearing forever every time I use this demo, you didn't see it because having your eyes open wasn't enough. You need to pay attention. And guess what happens when you use a phone? Your brain's attention system gets tapped out by that phone, and there's not enough left over to even scan the environment for that sidewalk where the kid might be running out. It now looks in a small region. It's not got enough processing power left over to fully attend to all this stuff. Lack of driver attention is the most common cause of crashes. 96% of crashes are due to human error. The other, 4%, 94% maybe, and the other 6% are primarily due to mechanical defects in tires. 80% of crashes are due to inattention. They are preventable if someone had been scanning for hazard properly. We don't multitask, we task switch. When you do one thing, your brain makes a choice to do that or something else. And when we use a phone while we're driving, the phone becomes the most important thing. Now, we're not gonna have much time for question and answers, so let me just answer a question that's always the number one question. What about an in-car conversation, right? You're saying talking is so difficult, why are all the in-car conversations not causing us to crash? Well, in-car conversations we know actually are hazardous. That's why we don't let teen drivers drive with a bunch of teen drivers, because that's what they tend to do. But, think about the last time you're driving here, let's say in Austin, and traffic got heavy and you're talking to someone in the car. What happened to that conversation? It stops, right? Or it decreased, right? When you're talking to someone who's a trained driver, we know that those conversations tend to get modulated as a function of traffic demands, whereas the cell phone conversation always maintains the same level of difficulty. And they tend to actually be more linguistically dense, to use a term my wife would use, than an in-car conversation. If it's not a trained driver, it's your kid in the back seat, blah, 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 shut up, I'm trying to drive, right? You modulate it forcefully. The other thing that a passenger can buy you that a cell phone can't is another set of eyes that can help you spot something that you might have otherwise missed. When I'm driving home in rural Kansas, I live 10 miles north of Lawrence, and it's deer season and my wife's in the car, she'll help me spot something that I might have otherwise missed. So you now have a second safety system in that vehicle when you have a passenger. The person on the phone's not gonna be, hey, look out for deer, just look around, I can't see them, but it doesn't work that way. So the in-car conversation might have some risk, but certainly not the same as the cell phone conversation. Now, what are we going to do about this guy? I'm going to go a couple minutes into our break, my apologies, but I want to give you some information on what you need to be thinking about doing. Here's what you need to understand about this soldier. I'm a former Army officer, field artillery. I got to blow up Oklahoma a few times. Hooah! Kill stuff from a long way away. That's my motto. All right, so this guy knows if he's my soldier and he's coming on to base and he doesn't have his helmet, he's going to get stopped by the MPs. They're going to give me a call. I'm going to have to get out of my jimmy jammies, come down to the front gate, deal with him. It's not going to be a good day for him. So he puts on his helmet because he knows that that's the rule. That's the law. He's got his reflective strap on his rucksack, same thing. Why is he texting? Because Kansas does not have a strong texting law. We have one. We tried to improve it. It got blocked because a senator from Western Kansas says, I'm from Western Kansas and I don't think we should legislate safety. Really? Okay, all right. I testified for an hour. It didn't seem to make much of a difference to him. He's doing it because he wants to, and he's wearing his helmet because he has to. And that's really the secret. The secret here is we talk about the 4 E's, education, we talk about engineering and everything else. We know this what we have to do here. Education, I'm sorry to say, is not going to get us out of this. It's just not going to. I wish that it would, because then I could give talks like this and walk away thinking I affected more than just the people in this room. But education by itself has never solved a problem. Right? It solves it for some people, but we had seat belts that went into effect and we had very low compliance rates, even though people knew that seat belts could save lives. Here's the secret sauce. If you don't walk away with anything else from a how can I change this perspective, what I want you to walk away with this. In order to change behaviors, don't focus on attitudes. The real secret sauce in psychology is that you change behaviors and attitudes follow, not the other way around. A lot of the times we think about, this thing's called theory of planned behavior, these kinds of behavioral models where, they talk about understanding the norms and changing behavioral attitudes. That changes someone's intention, and then they go out and do something. So tell someone, oh yeah, exercise is really important, eating right is important, so that's going to change their intention to exercise, and they're going to go out and start jogging, right? Does that work? No, it doesn't. What you have to do is you actually have to work on the behaviors. And we've known this for a long time. What you have to do is educate so the brain has a reason to engage in those behaviors. But what you really have to do is you have to have rules and enforcement first. And once you have rules and enforcement and people actually start engaging in those behaviors, then there's an interesting effect that happens called cognitive dissonance. If someone's buckling their seatbelt, for example, because there's a click it or ticket law campaign going on, and they're really doing it because they're afraid of getting a ticket, their brain goes, well, am I buckling up because I'm just afraid of getting a ticket and I just do whatever the man tells me? Or am I buckling up because I'm a safe driver and I know that this can save my life and I'm safe? Which is more comfortable for your brain? I'm a good driver. I'm putting on the seatbelt because I'm a good driver and it's the right thing to do. And what we see is when people start to comply with rules and we have enforcement to make sure they're complying with rules, attitudes change. I have a whole other talk on that, but I can tell you if you think back to drunk driving. The first drunk driving law went into effect in 1917 in New York. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember what it would have been like if you'd been pulled over in Texas for driving drunk in 1973. Would it have been like it is now? No. Sir, it looks like you're a little under the weather. Let's follow you home and make sure you get home safe. Now it's like you're a member of Al-Qaeda or something, right? It's a totally different experience. Why? Because in 1981, when Candace Lightner lost her daughter, 13-year-old daughter, to a 3 times convicted drunk driver, and she formed Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and she started to hold legislators' feet to the fire for laws that were already on the books, and mothers around the country started to get together and do the same, we actually started to enforce the laws we already had. And I can tell you that when you compare attitudes about drunk driving in 1973 and you compare those attitudes now, they've completely shifted. And the kids that drive using their phones now will tell you drunk driving is horrible, and they would never do it. Change behaviors, attitudes will come. But if all we ever do is try to change attitudes, we're going to be stuck in the same place we've been stuck for a long time. I'm sorry to say. And I know all of you understand that, and you've been working very hard to make that change. So please, keep doing it, because it's going to happen. People are dying because of inattention. There's no debate there. It's going to get worse. We're already seeing those data now, unfortunately. Our brain is not helping us on this one. If you want to blame your brain, because it's just not doing you any favors. It's letting you think you're going to get away with it, and it's really disguising from you how much you miss when you drive. And what we need laws, we need enforcement, and we need your leadership. I was presenting at a conference like this to 500 people in Missouri about 2 weeks ago, and the first speaker was the director of the Missouri Department of Transportation. He stood up and said, when I came on board, I think it was last year, we put in a policy, no Department of Transportation personnel are allowed to use their phone in any manner while driving. I cannot use my phone in any manner while driving. That's leadership. All of you have the ability to be leaders here. And believe me, you're not going to miss a darn thing. Thank you for your attention. If you're interested in reading more about this, there's a great book called The Deadly Laundering by Matt Richtel. Thank you for your attention today.